The Forked Ways. Chapter 17. The Camphorwood Chest. Mark Forrester had already made coffee, and he poured 2 cups as Fletch came down the back stairs into the kitchen. "You know, I was afraid to let you and Silver go last night. I didn't expect anything like what happened with Cotton Wills, but it's pretty clear I haven't been taking these things seriously enough." Fletch still felt numb and out of place. He had scarcely slept. Each time his eyes closed, he saw the blade of the sickle gleaming in the moonlight, the edge sweeping in a smooth curve as it slashed across Cotton's throat. He saw the blue lights of the patrol car slicing over the leaves and tree trunks, as he and Silver had pointed out the path which led to the labyrinth. He recalled the barrage of questions, the skepticism in the deputy's voice, the perplexity in his eyes. "He's from outside," Fletch remembered thinking. "How can we possibly explain any of this?" Silver had been outwardly calm, clear and precise in his answers. He and Fletch had just been hanging out together. Cotton had appeared out of the darkness, bleeding, irrational, wearing some kind of wolfskin cloak. Yes, they had heard something about what had happened with the Nelms girl. No, they had not seen Dwight. The deputy had left at last, dissatisfied, clearly aware that much had remained unsaid, but unable to determine anything more. "Cream and sugar?" Mark asked. "Just black," Fletch told him. "What's the brand?" "Chase and Sanborn, with a little red diamond thrown in." The can was almost empty. Fletch took the cup and leaned back against the counter. He inhaled the steam and sipped the coffee cautiously. "Dad, do you really believe in devils?" Mark raised his eyes. "Oh, yes. Not exactly in the traditional sense, but I believe they're real enough." Fletch tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Is it like in the cartoons? Devil on one shoulder, angel on the other?" "Something like that. There's an idea very old, dating back to the early church. Each of us is born with an angel brother and a devil brother, and they stay with us throughout our lives. I think they're part of us, really, but not just aspects of our personality. It's deeper than that." "How about visions, like waking dreams?" Mark nodded. "They're more common than you might think, but they can't all be trusted." He took a sip of his coffee. "They've begun, have they?" "Something's begun, Dad. Visions, dreams, Cotton Wills going crazy. This business with the WOG. And something about Betsy Weathers. She's right in the middle of it." Fletch looked at his father, measuring the space between them. "You and Betsy know something, don't you? What were you arguing about when I came home from the woods?" Mark stood up, went to the coffee maker and poured another cup. When he turned, Fletch could see the conflicting emotions in his face. "We were arguing about you." "But why?" "Betsy helped you after the accident. She was with you when you were in the hospital, and then we brought you here to Assembly to recover. I'm tremendously grateful to her, but she and I don't always agree." He hesitated. "You've seen her scars, haven't you, the marks on her hands?" Fletch nodded. "I always figured she was born that way, or had some kind of accident." "It was no accident. When Betsy was a girl, younger than you, the people here took her to the Sabbath Oak at the old campground and hammered nails through her hands. They drugged her, nailed her to a tree, and kept her there while they prayed and sang. It was hours before she even regained consciousness." Fletch felt suddenly sick. He sank onto one of the kitchen chairs. A minute passed before he was able to speak. "Dad, last night I dreamed I was drowning, and Betsy rescued me. At least I think it was Betsy. She was young, and there was blood on her hands. It's how she became what she is here in Assembly. She was crucified, and she became what they call the Paraclete. It's really a word from the New Testament, which the Church has tended to equate with the Holy Spirit. Each of our communities across the world has someone like her. She doesn't intrude, but she's never far away, and she has a hand in everything that happens. Mark took a breath, then continued. Fletch, after the accident, when you were in the hospital, it was really bad. There was a great deal of damage internally, and the x-rays showed trauma to the brain. Fletch nodded. I know it was bad, but I don't remember it very well. The coma made everything confusing. Mark sipped his coffee. It wasn't just a coma, Fletch. You were dying. In fact, apart from brain function, you were already dead. Betsy brought you back. Fletch stared at his father. But how? Mark shook his head. I'm not completely sure. I know she added something to your IV, drops from those glass bottles she keeps. She said it would help, but that it might not last. He smiled. It has lasted. You've done better than we ever dared to hope. That's why I'm seeing things, right? The visions are just memories of the past from the bottles. I suspect so. You know Doc and his wisecracks. He calls them distemporal infections. Fletch managed to smile, but his father still looked grave. What? Fletch asked him. What's wrong, Dad? Fletch, I've known Betsy all my life. I love her, but she frightens me. Mark sighed. We've been arguing about you because she wants you to take her place. Fletch looked out of the kitchen window toward the orchard with its old stone well. He thought of Betsy's hands, torn and bleeding, and felt dizzy and sick. I need to lie down for a while, he told his father weakly. He tried to stand, but couldn't quite manage it. The room tilted, and the floor of the kitchen rose to meet him. Mark caught him as he fell, and carried him into the parlor. Gently he lowered him onto the sofa. Everything in the room had become painfully vivid. The gold lettering on the leather spines of the books on the shelves, the colors of the paintings on the walls, the polished bricks of the fireplace, reflected images in a pair of silver candlesticks opened onto curving, flowing shapes of almost infinite depth and complexity. I'm not sick, Fletch whispered, just tired, and everything's really heavy. It was impossible to move, hard to speak or even breathe. I can hear Betsy knocking at the door. Silver's with her. Mark glanced toward the hall in confusion, and a moment later the knock sounded. He went to the front door and opened it. Something's happening to Fletch, he said, fear evident in his voice. That's why we've come. Betsy entered the house, carrying a long, polished walking cane. She looked back over her shoulder at Silver. Shut the door, quickly. Reluctantly, Mark admitted them to the parlor. Betsy, this has all been too much for him. He says he's just tired, but he can scarcely lift his head, and his eyes, they look odd. Betsy bent to look, and Fletch saw her own eyes widen. Silver came and stood beside her. Your eyes look green. What's happening? The wolf, I think, Fletch told him weakly. It's somewhere inside me. Betsy straightened. This is something I never bargained on. The wolf, whatever you want to call it, you've swallowed that devilish thing. Mark stared at her. What do you mean he's swallowed it? How could it be inside him? It hasn't possessed him. It's more like he's possessed it. The boy's captured it somehow, taken hold of it inside himself. She grasped Fletch's hands. Strength passed into him, and after a few moments he was able to move. "I'll tell you one thing, Fletch Forrester," she said, shaking her head. "I've never heard of anyone doing what you've managed to do. Even in my young days, I could only keep it at bay." "I'm sorry," Fletch whispered. "It was with Cotton, I think, and then it came to me." "That could be. A lot of things are changing," she told him. "I can't see the end of it, but it's happening quickly." Silver reached down, touched the side of his face, and as weak as he was, Fletch managed a smile. "I should never have done those spells, Fletch," Silver said quietly. "I didn't know enough. I treated it like a game, even though I knew it was dangerous." Fletch took his hand. Silver's face hovered above him, and there were worlds behind his eyes. "I could travel there," he thought. "We did the best we knew," he told him, "and it worked, kind of. Just not like we'd planned." Fletch slept, or thought he slept. He tasted mingled blood and rain. "My knives, my teeth, my sticks. Betsy?" She turned and met his gaze. "I had dreams or visions in the woods. You were there. You had a little cabin made of logs and a garden. Were you really there, or did I just imagine it?" Betsy almost smiled. "That's hard to say. I don't remember. Sometimes I see a great timber hall in my dreams. It was real once long ago, and so it must still exist in some form at the world's end. That hall is a meeting place, but if I ever met you there, I can't recall it." "You sang a song about it," Fletch persisted. "Something about a bed and a flood. I can't remember the words." "Under that bed there runs a flood. The one half runs water, the other runs blood," Betsy sang softly. "It's one of our old songs. Just a fragment, really. No one remembers all the words." "Were you really crucified?" "Yes, I was." "Betsy," Mark interjected, "he's very sick. His thoughts are rambling in all directions. This may not be the best time." Betsy ignored him, concentrating on Fletch. "I'm old and weary and can't live forever. There are dark times ahead, and Assembly will need someone young and strong, someone very brave. But I won't go against your wishes or your father's." "Dad says there are others in other communities." "There always have been, farther back than anyone can remember. We keep things, objects, stories, memories. Some are recent, some very old. And we draw bits of the future back into the present." "Like the memories in the glass bottles?" Fletch asked. "Exactly like that. But there are other things as well. If Mark agrees, I think it's time for you and Silver to see them." After a long moment, Mark Forrester nodded. "I suppose so. To tell you the truth, I'd like to see them again myself." He looked at Fletch. "Are you up for a walk to the church?" Though he still felt weak and unsteady, Fletch was able to stand and walk with Betsy, Silver, and his father down the driveway. They mounted the church steps and entered through the right-hand doorway. The room still held the cool air of the previous night, though sunbeams slanted through the round east window. In the morning light, the wood of the old communion table seemed to glow. Mark bent and released a hidden latch. He gestured for Fletch to help him, and together they lifted up a section of the wooden floor beneath the table, revealing a dusty brick-lined vault. Concealed within it was a large chest. The wood was deeply scarred in places, but overall the surface was so smooth that it looked as if it had been polished. Mark helped Betsy raise the heavy lid of the chest, revealing the sharp fragrance of camphor. She drew back a rough burlap covering, and beneath it another of white linen. She began to lift out items from the chest and pass them to Fletch and Silver. The first things Fletch saw were 3 robes of soft wool. Next, she handed up a set of linen altar frontals, embroidered with intricate designs. More items followed, a long shirt or gown of white silk, a collection of knives with handles of wood, ivory, and bone, small cloth pouches filled with powders and herbs. Silver unwrapped a set of reliefs carved of some translucent stone, depicting scenes from the Gospels. He passed Fletch a silver crucifix and a triangular instrument with metal strings. Mark opened a pair of cloth bags protecting a chalice and paten, the cup of wrought silver shaped like the trunk and branches of a tree, and the dish with a rim of intertwined leaves. Last of all were 2 wooden boxes, hinged and clasped. The first bore the design of a spiraling labyrinth inlaid in brass. Mark released the clasp and opened the box. Inside was a large leather-bound book. He lifted it out and opened it carefully, almost lovingly, and Fletch saw that the spiky black letters were written by hand, the margins carefully illuminated with red, blue, and green designs. He could make out nothing of the strange-looking text, but his father was able to read it aloud with little trouble. In the beginning, God made of naught heaven and earth. Forsooth, the earth was idle and void, and darkness wherein on the face of depth, and the Spirit of the Lord was borne on the waters. Mark looked up. "It's a Lollard's Bible," he told them softly, "handwritten in Middle English, almost certainly 15th century. I'd forgotten how beautiful it was." The second box was smaller, long and narrow, unadorned. Betsy held it a moment as if reluctant to open it. Then, when she lifted the lid, Fletch felt as if his heart had stopped. The box contained 2 long nails, forged of black iron. They helped Betsy to her feet and carried the items over to one of the front pews. "These things rightfully belong to all the friends of God, not just here in Assembly, but all over the world. Some of them have been kept for over 600 years. They've survived war and fire and persecution. People sacrificed their lives and gave up their homes to keep them safe, and to guard the beliefs that go with them." Her fingers trembled. Her voice seemed suddenly very old and frail. "Now, at last, they have come down to us. I find them in my hands, and I don't know what to do with them." Something about the silver crucifix struck Fletch as odd, and he picked it up to look at it more carefully. To his surprise, the figure on the cross did not appear to be Jesus, at least not as he was usually portrayed. It was, instead, the figure of someone much younger, but whether it was a boy or a girl he was unable to tell. On the back, words had been etched into the silver bar of the crosspiece. "I am fixed to the cross, that I live to God with Christ." There was much Fletch still did not understand. His doubts remained. But in those few moments a strange sense of conviction stole over him. His fear was very great, but it no longer stood in the way. He saw that he had been born to live beyond himself, to give his whole being to the love and care of his father and Silver and Betsy, and maybe even people who were quite unlike them. He turned to Betsy, and a kind of acknowledgment passed unspoken between them. She took his hand in hers. The room brightened, and he was startled to find himself holding the hand of a girl his own age. Her features were narrow and sharp, her eyes like green fire. "If you do this, everything will change," she told him. "Your senses, the things you feel for people, your movement in time, all the ways you understand the world. Day after day, year after year, you will die and live again as the seasons turn. You will see beneath things and above things and around things. If you are cut down, you will sprout again. You will bud and bring forth branches, stretching your hands between earth and heaven." As Betsy spoke, he could see images beyond her words, and events beyond the images. Time must surely have passed, but he was scarcely aware of it. Finally, she released his hand, and the light inside the church dimmed to that of the morning sun. It was his father who spoke first. "I'm sorry, Betsy, but no, I won't let him do this. If I have to, I'll take him away." Fletch turned from one to the other, trying to find words for the conflicting emotions he felt. But in the end, he loved his father and trusted his judgment. He looked at Betsy and shook his head. Her eyes revealed no anger, only resignation. "Betsy," Silver spoke softly, "why do you think it must be Fletch?" "There are a number of reasons, but something happened long ago. I received a visitation for which I was unprepared. A traveler came from the forked ways to bless a newborn child, and he bore the marks of the paraclete in his hands. The child was Fletch's mother, and the traveler was Fletch himself." "But how?" Silver asked, astonished. "We move through time." "Betsy, I don't understand how these things work, but I don't think the next paraclete of assembly is going to be Fletch. I think it's going to be me." Betsy looked at him, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Why do you think that, Silver?" "Because something happened to me last night after we left the clearing. I woke up in the middle of the night, hurting and scared to death. By the time the sun came up, I knew." Silver opened his hands. At first, Fletch could see nothing unusual. Then, as he watched, a glistening trickle of blood appeared, flowing from the center of each of Silver's palms. Being Drawn. Elizabeth Kendall woke to the distant drone of music. The sound was one she recalled from childhood, a bowed psaltery that produced long, sustained notes like the cry of the winter wind. As it faded, she realized that it had been within her dreams. The morning sun stretched across the floor of her bedroom. The old cat, Shaka Noak, slept by her feet. The house was silent. Silver was away. "He's going to tell her," she thought. "After all this time, it's happening at last." Oddly, she was no longer afraid. It was Silver's way, and her way, and Betsy's way, the way of their own people. Betsy had been so sure about Fletch that she had never considered Silver, but Liz had felt the threat and promise of it since his birth. What would become of the two of them, she wondered, her son and the Forrester boy? Liz didn't have Betsy's gifts, but she could see some way into Silver's guarded heart. She knew he had come to care deeply for the strange boy on whom so many of their hopes had been focused. Did he love Fletch? That night on the porch after the rain, the way they had looked at each other, as if they had just kissed. "I knew from the first," she thought. "From the day Silver brought him home, I knew he would steal my son's heart and take it far away. I saw it then and almost hated him, except that I knew I would love him too." She thought of Cotton Wills and wept. Long ago he had been a man with pale hair and magic eyes, bright, intense, and dangerous. He had kissed her and danced with her and loved her, though she was much too young. And when he had discovered she was pregnant, he had beaten her into unconsciousness. 3 days later, she took a tire iron from her parents' car and broke his jaw. She told him exactly what would happen if he ever came near her again, and Cotton, to his credit, believed her. For years he had stayed away from assembly, and when he had returned, he kept his distance. As far as she knew, he had never even spoken to Silver. Liz turned on her side. She remembered Mark's shy touch and his kind, world-wise eyes. There was strength in him, and patience, and something deeper. She, too, was being drawn, she realized, but she didn't know if the attraction came from Mark himself, or something beyond him, or maybe even something beyond herself. As she rose and dressed and made coffee, she realized she didn't care. Whatever process was in motion, it was something that, at least for the time being, she was willing to trust. Three coins. 4x banks stood on the high ground in the swamp, not far from the ancient stone building. The sun had just broken above the horizon, and now its rays were beginning to burn away the mist that veiled the trees along the rim of the valley. A pair of mockingbirds chased a crow in the tangle of a blackberry thicket, which screened the place where Dwight Wills lay. The boy was conscious, but unresponsive. His face and arms were scratched, and he was covered in mud. 4x didn't question him or press him to talk. His eyes were drawn by movement among the shadows beneath the brambles, but he could make out nothing more than the patterns of vines and branches. 4x gave Dwight a sip of water from his canteen, then soaked a handkerchief and began to bathe the boy's face. In his mind, he could see the cracked sidewalk in front of the barber's shop on Jackson Street in Winder. 4x had worked there in his teens, shining shoes and sweeping up. It was spring, and the year was 1936. Mr. Standridge had told him he didn't have to work that day. Neither of them spoke about it, but the reason was understood. The Ku Klux Klan would be holding a march along Broad Street, and most of the colored people would keep to their homes. But at 15, 4x was stubborn. He went to work. Though a small crowd had gathered on Broad Street, the back streets were mostly deserted. Carrying his shoeshine kit, he walked from Lightning Bug Alley to Stephen Street and turned left. Preacher Collins was coming from the First Baptist Church and tipped his hat. "You all right there, Ferguson?" "Yes, sir." "Best keep out of sight." "Yes, sir." They walked along Jackson Street together. Then the man turned the corner, and the street was empty. A block away, a thin white man in a Stetson hat walked up Candler. The man looked his way, and 4x shrank inside. It was Crowther Wills, who sometimes ran liquor with 4x's uncle. The man turned toward him, only it felt to 4x as if the man were standing still, and the world itself were turning. As the man approached, 4x unfolded his stool and opened his kit. "Shine?" It was one word, spoken almost indirectly, as if the street were crowded. 4x didn't want the business, but he didn't want to appear insolent either, not today. Crowther Wills took off his hat and mopped his brow. 4x saw that a cloth patch was sewn inside the crown of the hat, the emblem of a Confederate battle flag. The man propped a foot on the kit. He was wearing work boots, brogans, and they were muddy. 4x cleaned them and began working in the saddle soap. He was very much aware of the knife concealed in the man's right boot, and he could feel Crowther Wills' eyes following every movement of his hands. "Pig sticker," the man said softly, and he made a grunting, squealing sound and laughed. 4x willed his hands to keep steady. "You here to watch the parade?" "No, sir." He accented the words carefully. "Won't be many of 'em, no more'n 100. Damn shame if you ask me." 4x's hands paused uncertainly. "Nice morning like this should have been 2-3 times that many." Crowther Wills cleared his throat noisily and spat. A glob of mucus struck 4x's own scuffed shoe. It was yellow, almost fluorescent. It looked as if it might glow in the dark. A shadow fell across them, and Forby rose to his feet, turning to look at the person who had approached him from behind. A young Negro, as tall and slim as Forby was short and wide, white hair, green eyes. Forby slipped from between the two men and started to pack up his kit. "Wait," the black man said. He placed a hand on Forby's shoulder, but kept his eyes on Crother Wills. "You owe this boy for a shine." Crother Wills did not reply. He reached into his pocket, took out 3 coins, and dropped them into the street. Forby picked them up, not looking at them. Again he began to pack away his rags and brushes, but again the young man stopped him. Forby looked up and saw that Crother Wills was now halfway down the block. Forby squinted up at the man beside him. He didn't recognize him. "Thank you. Thought I was in for it. What's your name?" "John." The man knelt down on the sidewalk and took Forby's foot in his hands. He lifted it, positioning the boy's shoe on the kit. He wiped the shoe clean with a rag, then began to work in the polish with a small brush. "Man, you don't need to do that," Forby told him, but the grasp of the man's scarred hands was firm. "Allow me this honor." Forby wiped the back of his hand across his eyes. His hand was unsteady, and his eyes were wet. He clenched his hands and wept silently. Later, in Mr. Standridge's barber shop, he remembered the coins and looked at them. "Liberty, in God we trust, 1980. Forby didn't understand exactly what had happened, only that he had touched some other strange world for a moment, and come away with these 3 coins as a kind of token. As the years passed, he came to understand a bit more, but the sense of the remarkable never left him. He sometimes wondered whether the date on the coins would be that of his own death, but at last the year had arrived, and so far there had been nothing particularly momentous to mark its passing. Now, on a morning in the autumn, Forby wiped mud from the eyes of Crother Will's lost grandson, and again he found himself in danger of weeping. The boy was well on his way to becoming a devil like his grandfather before him, but surely there was a chance he could break free. Forby stood and made his way to the edge of the pit of black mud. "Crother Wills," he shouted, "you leave him be, you hear me? I'm paying for the boy, and I'm taking him home." Forby drew the 3 coins from his pocket and flung them in a high arc over the smoking pit. They spun, flashing as the sun caught them, then vanished into the smoke and steam. Crimson. Lamplight gleamed through the amber glass of a small whiskey bottle. Crother Wills lifted it, admiring the flicker of the light. The window beside him opened above Pigtail Alley, a narrow twisting lane in the worst part of Jug Tavern. Or was it Winder? That was one of the hazards of traveling, names and streets and the dates on coins. How did I get here? What year is it? Crother couldn't remember where he had come from, and he hadn't a clue as to the precise date. His best guess was sometime between 1903 and 1912. Hell, he thought, I'm just a kid. He was tempted to take a horse and go across the river to Assembly. No one there would know him, and he could visit himself as a boy, maybe even give himself some pointers about things to remember later on. He recalled a black child from the neighboring town. Where had they gotten him? Monroe? Someplace over that way. They hadn't much used their hands on him, hadn't dirtied themselves that way, only dragged him into a ditch and then used their boots, kicking him until he was unconscious, then continuing to kick him until they were sure he was dead. Crother hadn't been quite 20 at the time, but he'd done his part, honoring the ghost of his father and winning the approval of the men. It had been a good time to be alive. You could get away with things like that back then if you kept your head down and nobody talked. The lamp burned fitfully, and the globe was black with soot. The room was a poor one, hardly fit to sleep in. He would have better accommodations at the Granite Hotel on the corner, but not without attracting notice. In Pigtail Alley he could come and go at his pleasure, and people seldom marked his passing. Crowther Wills was good at keeping to the edges and out of sight. Gifts such as he possessed weren't suited to people subject to the sin of vanity. They would use them to attract attention and admiration, to be impressive rather than effective. Crowther descended the rickety stairs and slipped into the alley. The sounds of an argument came from around the corner, drunken voices raised in anger. He uncorked the bottle of Old Tennessee Club and dashed the whiskey onto the cobblestones in a pattern of curves and spikes. He lit a match and dropped it, watching the flame catch and spread. Then he stepped into the fire and moved swiftly along the path which opened before him. It led from the town into the open fields, and then into the forest. The years unraveled like a loose thread caught on a thorn. He followed the edges of streams and fire breaks, keeping dawn at his right hand and dusk at his left. The wind picked up, bringing a hint of autumn. Oak gave way to pine, and at last he stopped, indecisive. The path looked straight enough, but very dark. A glimmer of light came from somewhere far ahead. Crowther had heard stories about a great hall outside of time, where paths met and changed direction, a hall often occupied by enemies. He paused and lit a cigarette, considering. Then he moved forward through the trees until he came within sight of the building's windows. It was nothing like a hall, merely a tall house with a wide veranda. He had expected some kind of medieval ruin with broken arches towering over moss-covered walls. Still, it was not the building which interested him, but the thing that lived there. Crowther cloaked himself and stood silently as the boy descended the steps, lantern in hand. A second boy turned and disappeared inside. When he returned, Crowther looked at him more carefully. No doubt about it. Apart from his silver hair, the resemblance was striking. From the set of his chin to the smoke of his eyes, he looked like young Frank Wills. For a moment, Crowther thought the boy had seen him. He stood on the porch, scanning the darkness among the trees. Then he was gone, as swiftly as a passing shadow. Crowther marveled at this and felt a flicker of pride. But the first boy was the one who had drawn him. He was pure crimson, mysterious and beautiful. In the darkness he glowed like evening sunlight through red autumn leaves, lit from within by a magic radiance. Crowther knew that his son Cotton had brought this being to life, though not in the way he had intended, and the effort had cost Cotton his life. "Hast thou found me, O mine enemy?" Crowther watched as the silver boy followed the crimson one. They hadn't found him, not yet, but he had found them. This concludes part 1 of The Forked Ways. The second part, When We Were Gone Astray, will begin next week. These recordings were produced by R.J. Williams. Much of the artwork was provided by Virginia Williams and Carrie Hardin. I'm Beau Farr. If you're enjoying these recordings, please remember to subscribe and leave a note in the comment section. Be sure to check in at forkedways.com to listen to the books and to find out more information about Fletch and Silver and the town of Assembly. The Forked Ways is copyright 2020 by Beau Farr. All rights reserved.